All right. We had our meeting last week about the what one of the topics and that came up was actually a rerun of I think Brenda suggested it after Dwight was asking about how do one do it does one do a presentation. So he wanted some ideas and it came up since I've I've done some of your members that have been around for a while, like who were there for in 2018, would have heard this, so it'd be a rerun. But I know we have some new members. Uh, so this one of the things that it came up, and I was always interested in this one because uh, it was I found out when during my genealogy research days that one of my third great grandparents was a Black Loyalist. And I was like, it's a Black Loyalist. So I thought that was going to be an interesting way to, why is it not advancing? Oh, here we go. So I, I said, why did I become interested in the Black Loyalists? When I was a child and almost until age 6, one of my great grandmothers, my mother's mother's mother lived in the same house. And I always, people always show these uh, um, well, four generational pictures, sometimes even more. But, my great grandmother there was 93 when my sister was born. So there was a photo with me as well, but I thought that using my sister there would have been nice to have all the females of my family there at one time. Um, this was the summer of 56. Um, Now my mom later on I mean obviously when I in summer of 56 I wasn't really good on geography. uh, But my mom always told that after my great grandmother had passed in um, a few years later, um, in 59, that she had been born in Nova Scotia, and one of the things that I mean that was one of our early trips, family trips. And we drove from New York to Nova Scotia in 1964. So my mom always thought that, well, my great grandmother Irene had been Scottish or Irish, but she didn't know for sure. But she also knew that her so her great grandfather, one of her great grandfathers had been a minister, but she didn't know what church or where. So, as I said, I mentioned we visited um, Port Latour, Nova Scotia, which is a little town, and I think that I showed down at the base where that little red block, extreme southwestern Nova Scotia was. And we drove all the way around there. And what I remember was interesting. We turned on the radio, and it could actually get a New York radio station from that distance because it's like all ocean that's across there. And I didn't know AM radio went that far at that time. But my mother had been the family historian for her family um, side, and she had looked at a lot of different things. Some of her cousins would come by the house, visit my grandmother because my grandmother was the oldest of her siblings, but nobody knew why Nova Scotia was so important to us. And even when I went to, history, social studies in junior and senior high school, I didn't learn anything about Nova Scotia. We don't talk much about Nova Scotia, or even when they talk about Canada, Nova Scotia stays off as, oh, nothing much really ever happens there. But it was like, okay, what? Nova Scotia? So I didn't become involved in genealogy until 1991. And my research uh, advanced my learning about my family, but still not really enough to understand my Nova Scotian roots. And the breakthrough didn't come until 2004, when I'm 50 years old, that I find out that, well, it did have some importance in understanding that. One of my second cousins had visited there. He had heard about Nova Scotia. He had made a trip there, and um, so he found out that we were connected to Argyle Keeling, one of my great grandmother's great grandfathers, and I think yes, that's right. And uh, Argyle Keeling had been a Black Loyalist. He had mustered with the British. I can't really see that part in 1783, and so it still was a Black Loyalist. What's a Black Loyalist? Was my question. Well, it's interesting. This is actually, you saw the picture of my great grandmother when I was a child. This is the one. She's the taller one in the middle between her mother and father. I was absolutely astonished. My grandmother had this photo, and I figured out it was about 1871, which I didn't. So that was one of our family photo from that era. So that was my seated as my great great grandmother, and or second great grandmother, as they call it, and the second great grandfather that lived in Nova Scotia. So I did this the last time, and this is a rerun. The the we talk about American history, and we go there. So I mean, it's a little different to try to do it with the virtually, but I'll say. So I'll ask the questions. I'll let you think about it. I won't be able to see your hands while I'm doing the presentation like we did when I did it live, but um, in person. So how many of you, and maybe you can answer, studied the American Revolutionary in high school? Would I be correct in saying just about everybody?
The part that they were willing to share.
But I'm sure I remember, we learned, a lot started with the American Revolution, although it seemed like it was always about the Tea Party. But I'll go from there. The next question was, could anybody tell me when the Revolutionary War started? Oh, and you get yes. I'm sure we have ideas of when. Um, Now, anybody want to proffer up the when the where the Revolutionary War started? Do I have a volunteer?
Boston Common.
Okay. So here is a history major, right? No, I know you're into law now. You may have, like all of us, we had to study social studies, and that was a required for at least most of people I know.
So, Gary, was that the Boston Tea Party that started?
No, not
Okay.
exactly.
I'm getting my wars mixed up.
No, you're right. It just came a little bit. I don't think well, I kind of there, right there close together, but that
Oh, okay.
yeah,
And they
they
shot Crispus Attucks.
Oh, okay.
yes.
How about that?
Okay. Yeah, I remember that.
That came a couple of days like earlier.
Oh,
Now, I wasn't a history buff per se when I even in 2004, so it took me a while to get to understand it. Now, it gets a little because you get back to the could you tell me why the Revolutionary War started? And there's you get the Tea Party thing. Well, we don't want to be under British anymore. We don't like them. They're going to tax us. even though they've been taxing you or the adults have been taxing you for all your life at the time, any adults that were around in that when the war started. But there was a lot of different things that went on there. And, you know, it gets even worse. Well, when did the Revolutionary War end? I mean, we know that there was some issues there too. And so I know for most of us who've been out of school for, I'll say in my case, over, 50 years for high school. I mean, 55 now. I didn't I was like, when did it end? So you had all these questions. Now, when I asked the question the last time, and nobody had ever heard of the Black Loyalists, and it was sort of a thing that I didn't know. Like I said, when I got into it, I didn't at the time in 2004, I had never heard of that until 2004. Now we get to another. So of course, everybody's heard about Paul Revere. We know Patriots Day coming up here next month in April. It's usually around tax day. I think at the with Paul Revere, and he made his famous ride. And most of us also heard about Benedict Arnold. He was deemed to be a traitor. Now, Melvin just reminded us there was a name that came up that very few people had actually heard. I don't remember hearing this when I was in school, although I think there was some mention that it did bring a memory. Crispus Attucks. But what was interesting too was James Somerset. Now that was a name nobody ever used, nobody ever heard. There was like, okay, but we'll see in a minute exactly what his role was. So one other thing that I always thought was interesting, and again, doing it live, when you're doing it virtually, it's hard to put up your hands because it makes the screen too small to read if I try to see you guys and the screen. But the issue is how many of you identified the names of your well, almost everybody tends to know their great grandparents unless they were adopted. But you get into your second great grandparents, it decreases, goes back, that's your 5 generations back, and it gets smaller and smaller. Your third great grandparents, it took a long time for me to get most of them. Fourth great grandparents, even harder. And generally, by the time you get to fifth great grandparents and sixth great grandparents, the number is close to zero. For most everybody. Although I'll sort of put in an advertisement that was sort of fascinating. One of my third cousins, actually third cousin once removed, he's been heavy into genealogy. He said, have I looked at one of the features on Family Search, and it has a feature of famous relatives in the activities, and it sort of exposed me to what I believe is even going back to it at least it shows me what theoretically are as far back as I think 14th or 15th great grandparents for me, because it said that I was related ninth cousin, 10th cousin, 12 cousins removed to 22 of the US presidents. But that's a presentation for another day. We'll talk about that because I think is interesting, and you'd be amazed at what some of the findings are if you go just use Family Search. So one of the things I ask is how many of you have relatives of African ancestry that live or lived in Canada? And sometimes, like I said, if you'd asked me this question before 2004, I would have said, well, my great grandmother was born there, and that was all I knew. So now it took me a little while to work to this point, but I'll put it this way. The year was 1770. There were 19 British colonies in the continental North America. Throughout these colonies lived many persons of African ancestry. Most, if not all, of these people of African ancestry had either been brought to North America against their wills as slaves or were direct descendants of slaves brought several or many years earlier. Depends on where the landing was. Some date back into the early 1600s. Um, some more than 400 years ago. This is where we talk about a fatal shooting by British soldiers in Boston triggers unrest in most of the colonies. 13 of them tended to be, as you'll find out. 5 years later, he said it was 1770, the armed conflict known as the American Revolutionary War starts on 19th of April, 1775. And the name we mentioned earlier, Paul Revere, had his famous ride the evening before. And then that on beginning of it was the Battle of Concord and the Battle of Lexington. Now I get them in order. I remember I think I made a boo-boo one time and got them reversed. But now when I'm thinking about it, I tend to still forget which is first. But the British were marching into those parts of Massachusetts colony. Now, during the war that ensued to the next few years, many former and escaped slaves joined with the British against the rebellious colonists, and many died. These were the Black Loyalists, those who decided that slavery wasn't the way they wanted to go, and that was they would fight for their freedom because the British promised them land and freedom when they won the war. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris on September the 3rd, 1783. And what happened to the Black Loyalists is the question. Well, let's take a look at what evolved, because I think it's important to understand that in the settling of pre-Revolutionary War British America, in 1500, Spain had began establishment of the colonies throughout the New World. There was Spanish Florida, Puerto Rico, and Texas. And in 1605, some of the other colonies were like the French established a colony in what became Nova Scotia. It was they called it Acadia then. And they did import a few slaves, African slaves there in 1605. The British came by and started a little bit further south in Virginia, what's now Virginia, the first British colonial establishment of Jamestown. And the 1615 Dutch settled in what's now part of what we call upstate New York, but it's near present-day Albany, New York. They called it Fort Nassau. In 1638, Swedish came and established what they call Fort Christina near Wilmington, Delaware. So obviously, most all of these places are along the East Coast because they came from Europe, and they obviously when you sail west, the first part of North America you hit is the coast. But they landed at different parts. Now, why did the British become predominant? Is one of the questions. Well, the British were, I won't say we might use the term warmongers, but they seem to be if they wanted something, they got it, and they tended to be strong. And there, so there were the British wars with the indigenous people who lived in the United States before the colonists arrived. Uh, you know, it wasn't just the animals that lived here on North America in the 1500s. It was, the indigenous people who had been there centuries before. We wanted to call we tend to call them the Indians, even though that's because some of the people of early European thought that they had arrived in India back then. But the war with the indigenous peoples, they managed to take their land. They they had the war with the Netherlands, and they trampled them. They had a war with Spain, and they beat them. And of course, they had war with France. Well, they had a long war with France, or many wars with France, because seemed like they were fighting all the time. Eh, I think it came from the closeness of just being across the English Channel that France was not one of their friends. So you go back and you say, well, the most apparent primary contributing factor for shaping pre-Revolutionary War British North America was war. So the war with Spain, yeah, during the period of the colonization in the world, there were 8 periods of significant conflicts with Britain and Spain. War was not formally declared, but there were casualties on both sides. They they were probably most well known, that was actually taught, if I can remember from social studies, was mentioned in my social studies class, and it didn't last that long, the Anglo-Spanish War, 1762 and 1763. And as a result, Spain relinquished the colony of Spanish Florida, which had low slavery, to Britain. Britain split Spanish Florida into 2 colonies, East Florida and West Florida. And then slavery tended to increase when the British took over by 1770. So now, war with France was a little bit different story. And one um, person who studied that uh, period well published a book on it. Um, said in the 156 years between 1607 and 1763, the British and the French were officially at war with each other over 1/3 of the time. And it's safe to say that somewhere on the thousands of miles of frontier between the British, the French, and the Indian allies of both sides, aggressive actions were being taken on every day of the whole period. And, obviously, like I said, there's the name. Mary Rhinelander McCarl was the reference for that. And the most significant outcome came in what was called the French and Indian War, that was fought between 1754 and 1763, in which New France became a British colony. So the British were powerful. Now, somebody always asked me, well, 19 colonies, we never really talk about 19 colonies. Well, if you go in back and look at what they were and study that, you'll find, oh, they were Canada. The easternmost part, as Newfoundland, is sort of go from the upper northeast and go down to the farthest southwest corner of these 19 colonies. The next smallest one was near Newfoundland, was British Prince Edward Island, and that's tiny compared to the rest of any of the Canadian. Now, Nova Scotia at the time in 1770 was both Nova Scotia and what became New Brunswick. So that's another part. So it was bigger than it was before they split the provinces. And Quebec, and that included Eastern Ontario. Some may know that Ontario today is the largest Canadian province. It's also has, I think I just looked it up this past week with all the discussion about Ontario, some 40% of Canada's population. with the largest city being now Toronto. Then we had New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay Colony, they called it, which included Maine. Now, I don't remember whether that little piece of New Hampshire that's between the two was part of Maine or not, but Massachusetts Bay had most of Western Maine and both north not and so northeastern Maine. I'm not sure what part with that was part. You had Rhode Island and then Providence plantations, Connecticut, which was smaller than most, but the population wasn't so large, so you didn't need a lot of land. New York, and which includes pretty much most of present day Vermont, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland. We talked about Virginia, but Virginia also included what now became Kentucky and West Virginia. North Carolina stretched out to include most of present-day Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, and then, as mentioned, Florida, which was East Florida and West Florida. And West Florida was now part of southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, and the portion of Florida west of the Alabama-Georgia border extension. So you see here on the map, it's sort of most of the reddish color, so it didn't extend quite to the Mississippi River as we know it today, but it did get a good chunk of it. The 13 colonies that we know so well are there. You see how the British first, got most of it. Then they also put in the Indian Reserve. I found this in one of the references. So the demographics we look at, well, how much in 1770? There were 19 colonies I mentioned. The population was about 2.3 million people. There were 20% were slaves, as the blacks were all pretty much all slaves, although in the early part. The most populous colony was Virginia, 447,000 people, and with about 42% were slaves. The highest concentration of blacks, though, was in South Carolina, where more than half, over 60%, were black slaves. In third most populous colony was Massachusetts Bay. Now here you start to see that they differ quite a bit, because Massachusetts, while there were slaves there, was 2% black. It kind of, I was trying to figure out the best way to show this then, and you see that on the ones that are on the left side, there's the fraction of the columns are very small when it comes to you don't see any really significant one until you get down to New York, and even Delaware did not have many slaves, but then as you get down there, the percentages go up. I probably could have done it differently too, but to give you an idea of how the population was distributed amongst all the 19 colonies. So now we get back to as Melvin mentioned, the unofficial start of the American Revolution. It was the Boston Massacre, became known as the Boston Massacre. It was on May the 5th, which we just passed, another anniversary. Boston and Massachusetts Bay Colony, March the 5th, 1770. And it was a shooting death of Crispus Attucks, a person of mixed African Native American descent, and 4 others by British soldiers in mob control duty, which further raised the ire of the colonists from Massachusetts to Georgia. Now, I mentioned the name James Somerset because that was, I think, what really starts to be an interesting point when you've realized this. In late 1771, a case was brought before the English court of the King's Bench involving a British North American slave named James Somerset, formerly of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Somerset had been brought to England, escaped from his slave master Charles Stuart, and then, upon his recapture, was imprisoned for transport to Jamaica. Somerset had some godparents, and they brought suit about his unlawful imprisonment. And the Chief Justice on May 14th, 1772, Lord Mansfield ruled that in this case, emancipated James Somerset in England, citing there was no statute in England to support slavery. Wait a minute, there's no law that you can't do this. So while now it was in England, and British on the other side of the ocean, the colonies. So while this ruling was in England was not intended to be a legislative action, nor was it to be directly applied to the colonies, it helped launch the movement to abolish slavery in Great Britain and also raise North American slave awareness of a possible way out of slavery. Many colonists believe this ruling against slavery would eventually be forced upon them as well. So now we get back to what we call the official start of the American Revolution, which, the British soldiers would begin to march to Concord and Lexington, Massachusetts Bay, and confiscate weapons from the colonists. And Paul Revere rode his horse to Lexington and Concord to warn the colonists that the British were coming. And they had it massed in Boston and were coming the next day. Now it's a long walk from Boston to Concord, but that's what soldiers did. So on the 19th of April in 1775, the conflict started. In Concord, the colonists put up quite a fight and basically would say they won that conflict. Lexington wasn't quite the same. Lexington Green, as they called it then. Now, not all of the British colonists were opposed to British rules, and many believed the rebellion would soon be quashed by the apparently superior British military might. The British forces had defeated combined France and Spanish forces in only 12 years earlier. They had been, as I said, they won all the wars. Why are they going to lose to the ragtag group of colonists? To really, some of them, they weren't fighters. They weren't trained military. This belief about the British might have been especially true for the four northernmost colonies who decided to fully support the British. Those are the ones that are in Canada. These supporters were called the United Empire Loyalists. The actual proportion of colonists who were loyalists were not known, since the colonists who were opposed to British viewed loyalists as traitors. And all the news in Canada today, that's part of it, that Canada wanted to go their separate ways because their view on slavery became quite different. They didn't have that many slaves, as we saw in the demographics, and they didn't understand. And there was also a feeling that using free labor was a disproportionate way to compete. So, as I mentioned earlier, the British promises to slaves escape to help them was you get freedom and you get land. This word spread across the 13 other colonies that we've come to know. Some assisted British covertly. You didn't want to tell your neighbors you were supporting the British because they might not feel that same way. They estimated that escaped slaves during the conflict, there were about 100,000 slaves that escaped, or about 20% of the overall slave population in North America. And South Carolina had lost, about 25,000 slaves, or one third of the number they had. I won't go through this table, but it gives you an idea of when things started from the British side, the Black Loyalists. They did still keep them somewhat separate. Usually there was um, a, a British general or captain or lower major, whatever, that was in charge of the various regiments. Uh, and they gathered all in the various colonies, like Virginia. I forget, I didn't have a reference for the King's American Regiment. North Carolina, New York, Philadelphia. So the British soldiers, we do hear, they even gathered on what was part of Long Island and now Brooklyn and Queens and Nassau and Suffolk County. Um, the the issues came up that they did have some key battles with the colonists at that point in time. So the war went on it was from quite a few years. When you think about it, from April of 1775, and now we're into 1783, there were armed conflict all over the land that was the part of those 13 colonies. Um, that, but then towards the end of, as 1783 went on, the the British started to realize they were not going to win this war. So to make good on their promises, and they had 20,000 for escaped slaves. Um, they had major evacuations from New York City, Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. Now, a lot of the Black Loyalists ended up in London, England, under naval escort. And they estimate about 3,500 ended up going to Nova Scotia, which was a lot closer. Although you realize, where we were coming from the South, going from Nova Scotia, if you've ever watched weather patterns, you realize that Nova Scotia weather was not exactly similar to Virginia or South Carolina. There were numerous Black Loyalists who were captured because those who didn't make it to these ports. There were some that went south, down to Florida. They went to the West Indies, and there was those who were able to escape north of into the Canadian province of what is now Ontario. So the Black Loyalist evacuees, most assimilated and lived the rest of their life. So the ones in Britain, and it's sort of reflected even today when you see a lot of the British TV shows, and the population there. I forget what the population of the United Kingdom is, but London does have more than 10% Blacks. In Ontario, most assimilated and lived the rest of their life in Canada. Nova Scotia was a little bit complicated. And why? Because it was cold, and they had been taught to grow their own food and things like that. And Nova Scotia's growing season wasn't very kind. But so the Black Loyalists who evacuated to Shelburne, and that's where I started this story. The British recorded the names and sometimes unflattering descriptions of those relocated former slaves in it's I won't read the unflattering out, but it is interesting when you read some of what we would take as like, oh my gosh, today. Broken down person, that kind of thing. That was probably one of the nicest thing they would say. The Black Loyalists did settle, and initially it was southwestern. You see on the map there, not too far from where my great grandmother was born, as you see in that little part just down in extreme southwestern Nova Scotia. It's Shelburne Harbor. They called it Birchtown, and by 1785, it was the largest settlement of free blacks in the world outside of Africa. It was freedom that they had, but it was a broken promise. Because land in southwestern Nova Scotia was too scarce to supply the influx of new residents, many white loyalists were given priority to the land. Only about 29% of the Black Loyalists got a land allocation near Shelburne. Others soon went a little bit further away to Liverpool, Digby, and Yarmouth, and even as far away as Halifax. Yeah, it's a 1 hour drive today on the superhighway from Birchtown location to Liverpool. Well, it's mostly 2 lanes, but it's got a pretty high speed limit. And Halifax, it took me 3 hours to drive it. Just to give you an idea of how, it's quite a ways. So doing that with horses and walking takes quite a while. Well, but I do this. Oh, how'd I go back so far? It's because I'm on the road. Okay. So then the others fled to new colony of New Brunswick that had separated from Nova Scotia. So they started, the blacks in Canada started to spread out, and actually with the lower population, they were still, they were able to, as it says, the land allocation was generally not sufficient for self-support, especially given the very short growing season in comparison to the Carolinas and Georgia. Nova Scotia weather also had to be perceived to be very harsh to most, especially to those who had never before seen snow. The white employees further in the area further exploited blacks, in some cases paying only about 1/4 what they paid the white employees. And so there was a back to Africa movement back then, and some of them, but it was kind of tricky. In 1791, the Sierra Leone Company was established by the British to transport the now free Black Loyalists to West Africa. They would get more land, they would get land more suitable for growing crops, they would have a chance to build their own community. But there were risks in making this long journey. Some of there were bounty hunters, and there were slave traders that were roaming the Atlantic Ocean. So obviously the blacks stood out, and it was only those who could get really, it was a risky trip to take, and there weren't that many trips that were made. And I ended up in what's now, so nearly half of the Black Loyalists who decided to leave Nova Scotia and head to Sierra Leone. Now, they don't have the exact number of the population. They would, say, well, you said 3,500 went there, so there would be 1,750. But, they also this was a few years later, and so there were more children, and, the population had changed a little bit. They found out in Sierra Leone that other dark-skinned people did not speak their language. If you realize that most of those who decided to make the trip spoke English, while those who were native to Sierra Leone at the time did not speak English. So they had a communications gap, and apparently very little way to talk to each other at the start. So they ended up having to build their own town, which became known as Freetown, and it's still many descendants there today. For those who chose to stay in Nova Scotia, many lived the remainder of their lives in Nova Scotia as they generally assimilated into the white community and eventually became respected citizens. So I'll put it this way: when the dust of the Revolutionary War had settled, approximately 100,000 slaves had escaped from the institution of slavery. Of course, modern history books teach little about those brave people who face many obstacles in their struggle to be simply treated as human beings. You know, perhaps some view these Black Loyalists as traitors, like General Benedict Arnold, while they were really heroes that played a role in abolishing slavery. And finally, while most Black Loyalists did not live through the next 80 years that it took to eradicate slavery in all of the United States, their legacy was the beacon of hope that they provided to those slaves who chose to flee from slavery to points north in the years that followed. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. And are there any questions?
I guess
Go ahead.
well, this is something I've been thinking about recently. You know how we always say that what comes around goes around, or what goes around comes around.
Yeah.
And I keep wondering to myself, does history repeat itself at all times? And I relate this question to what you just told us about the Revolutionary War. And I'm thinking about present times. Is history going to repeat itself?
That's always a interesting question because I mean usually you see you go further back and I was never really a history buff until I got involved in genealogy because I realized how much you have to understand. But yeah, there's been armed conflicts around the world for as long as mankind has been around. And sometimes some of the things look really silly when you look in retrospect, but they go back and years later, just like we had World War I and World War II. And whether we're headed to World War III or not has always been, it's a question since I've been a little boy. So, I mean, your point is well taken. Do we want to head back to some of these long times long ago? To us. But you are right there. What goes around does come around, and it doesn't take.
Is Mary Jane asking, do we have to get ready to flee to Nova Scotia? Not to get too political, but Gary, I want to ask you though specifically, and maybe you alluded to it, but do you still have relatives that you've been able to identify living in Nova Scotia or in Birchtown or the town, the community where your great grandmother was born?
Do I have?
Yes.
Yes. And it was funny because one of my second cousins, we had a joint trip 10 years ago, well, 13 years ago, when his kids were little. And we went to a restaurant in Halifax and we were talking and we talked to my cousin asked one of the waitress if she knew so-and-so because he saw her name. And she said, yes. And she was related to us.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Fifth cousins. In fact, I became very close to one of my fifth cousins. She had she had started her genealogy. This is back in like 2008 and 9, and had got sort of stuck ran into the Keelings, and she knew her father had been in the it was the British military, and he had been in the Black Regiment of the British military. His grandfather and great grandfather was, of course, one, and she had tracked him back, and So she had started tracing and she ran into a killing. Now they had made an error. So she was kind of queasy. And then she saw one of her friends had found me who had just discovered my killing, great third and fourth great grandparents. Um, and she contacted me and we became good close friends. She unfortunately passed away about 3 years ago. But I mean, I talked to her husband, her widower, just yesterday. So yes, I'm still and obviously her sister is still around, and so she's a relative. And as I go across Nova Scotia, we went to the Birchtown Museum, and yes, actually my cousin did back in 2012, and he talked to the one who was at the desk, and he was related to us. So and I had it is funny when I do go to Canada because I had to have I didn't even know it back when I had to work in Toronto, but as I've gone through, I know were probably related to me as well because I visited in more recent years I went and visited some of the ones that I had worked with back in the 90s before I knew anything about um, specifically Nova Scotia. And then, yes, I was related to one who was in Toronto. So, I asked the question, I mean, how many of us know that we have or don't have? And for those of African American uh, ancestry, have a tendency to always think about the South, but and that's probably true because the lion's share was in the South. But there were those who did escape from the South, and as I mentioned, as we go through some of these things, as we get further and further back and to find more and more of our ancestry, we might find that we do have relatives in Canada these days.
Gary, this is Brenda.
Yes,
Are any of your relatives listed in that book of Negroes?
I did find Argyle Keeling.
Uh-huh.
Yes, he was listed. What I believe to be what might be his parents, I think it was a Ralph Keeling, and he was one of those old and broken down people, as they kind of described. I don't remember if that's the exact word, but it was kind of like that, old and decrepit and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and uh, so I know them. I did try to trace them down, but there were so many intermarriages of those early on that yes, I'd have to say yes, but I don't remember because it was hard for me to get back to fourth grade some of the other fourth grade grandparents I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't find any because they didn't really do the censuses. So I do run across like names nowadays. And a lot of people have actually moved, and I don't know when. I was my wife. I was trying to track down someone. One person. She's actually a world record track star in her 80s. She's gotten the world records for 75, 70, and 80, and now 80. It should be 85 next year, I think. Female track star. She's got all sorts of records there. Um, and she lives in Saskatchewan, which is a Western province. So my wife's related to her. My wife's family, from what I know, was born in Virginia. I haven't been able to fully track the connection that for the one that's in. Well, obviously I know that, but around her because she lives in that part. People emigrated to Western Canada like they did in the Western United States from Eastern Canada. So I know I have relatives there now. Whether I know that I would find some in Vancouver or north of where I am right now, I'm not sure. But I do know that going through different parts of Canada, I have Canadian relatives. Mostly fourth and fifth cousins type there.
I was trying to figure out why the president that we have now wanted to have Canada become the 51st state. Because I think yesterday he made some silly comment about, well, they belong to us because somebody just took a marker or something and just drew a line. So,
Well, yeah, it was the difference in philosophies 250 years ago that drove the countries apart.
mhm.
Canada wanted to stay with Great Britain. They felt that they wanted to abolish slavery. Pretty much after 1790, slavery was abolished in Canada. There were a few holdouts that lasted a few more years. But if you go back, obviously, they were saying even in Delaware and New Jersey, there were still slaves till the 1830s, almost, 70 years later, that slavery was still in existence. If you look at how Pennsylvania dissolved slavery in 1825, not 1820. It was I did another presentation on that. It gets me confused. I think in 1770 they passed a law that the slaves, those of African descent born before March 1st of 1780 would be slaves for the rest of their lives. Those born after would be slaves until age 28. So theoretically, the way, so somebody born in February of 1780 could still be a slave until, 28 years later. And so you have that complete difference in philosophy. And, yes, I mean, some of the older ones know that, even in the southern states, it was difficult. I mean, I have friends that grew up in the South, and they talked about when they were younger, it was kind of tricky to go be as an African or as a Black person to walk through some of the streets, and Martin Luther King was only he walked in the 50s when I was a 3 to 5 year old. So, my mother knew of some of the bitterness there was between the races in the United States, and the same was not that true in Canada. You didn't have, my cousin-in-law, he was telling me yesterday the difference. Well, he was, he married. Now my cousin Saritha, who passed away, she's only 12, listed her, I think her DNA, she's only 12% African, but still, she could tell that she had a nice tan.
Mhm.
Her husband is pretty much, Caucasian. I don't think he had any. He has African. I have his DNA too. He doesn't have any African in listed. But he was telling me this story. He grew up. It was all the people are the same. So he's 1 year older than me, and it's like, so it's a whole different philosophy when you compare our childhoods, just the two of
Mhm.
us. So your answer is, Canada wanted to be different, and they had a different view on the races. That was, there was a lot of assimilation. Like I said, you look at a lot of Canadians, they don't view race as important as it has been in the United States.
I just find it absolutely amazing in all the research I've done that I have not found yet any of my ancestors to be slaves or been on a plantation. And I know that's just unrealistic.
Well, my mom, like I said, I started the story. I told her she thought one of my great grandmother was Scotch or Irish. She did not know. If you saw a picture of my mom, I did show it one time. She was quite fair, but
Mhm.
she was 40% African by her DNA. But and she actually got treated badly from both blacks and whites, because
Right.
the whites you say, well, she's not gonna look like, like that. And my mom would, a school teacher, my grandmother had to go up to school, and the teachers, disrespected my mom for that reason,
Mhm.
and so, race has always been more part of American culture than it was. I'm sure there was parts of Canada that there's problems with, but like I said, just hearing it from my cousin's uh husband was like, yeah, he said he never thought it. He just they go eat together. They do when he was a kid in the 60s, and it was a different country.
Mhm.
Any other?
Gary, this is not a question, but when you talked about Birchtown, I was looking up Birchtown, and it corroborates what you said about it being the largest uh, free settlement of Africans here in North America. But also, it talked about how much of the population they lost in that back to Africa movement. They petitioned the British government for a solution when the promises of land were not kept.
Yeah.
And the solution was to go to Sierra Leone, and it was quite a few. Birchtown is not very big today.
No, it's
And a lot of the folks there moved to the larger community, Shelburne, I believe,
Shelburne,
for
yeah.
jobs and all of that. But yeah, a lot of people left Birchtown.
Well, yeah, I mean, Birchtown itself it's out in the woods. I mean, it's when you go there, there's a really great museum. Actually, it built over in the last 10 years because the when we went there in I had an opportunity to go there a couple of times. And but even if you go like to Port Latour, I had a hard time finding Port Latour. Just like, I think 50 people live there now.
Wow. Okay.
And the Bert, they did tend to settle in, like I said, Liverpool. My third my third great grandparents and second and lived in Liverpool. Liverpool was a shipping town. It became like Shelburne. Shelburne was sort of it was a protected harbor, but it wasn't. I guess it wasn't as great for fishing as further south or further north along the coast. So I think it was, and it wasn't good. It wasn't good for much there. It is a little town there. I mean, if you go to Main Street, Shelburne is like, you drive into that and it's like, oh, this is about it. So it has, and Shelburne is bigger than Birchtown, but it is like I mean, Halifax is probably at least a third of Nova Scotia population. It may even be higher than that. I haven't looked at the demographics and the census population recently from their 2021 census, but Nova Scotia just under 1 million people, and Metro Halifax is probably 500,000. So most of the people in Nova Scotia live there. You go to, even the next biggest town they're all clustered around there. And then you get to like Yarmouth, which is Western. It's where they run a ferry to Maine. Is I won't say a big town, but it's got a cluster of people there. And so they even had an airport. They have an airport there because it is so far from Halifax. But it is interesting, like I said, you see a lot of people, and there's, as I said earlier, race doesn't seem to be as important to Canadians, or hasn't been, from hearing the discussions from my Canadian relatives about it. There's a lot more, intermarriages in years gone by, that interracial marriages were not frowned upon like they were. I mean, they were, as some know, like in Virginia was against the law, and so was in North Carolina. I think it was against the law for interracial marriages. So, Canada did not do that. But all right, any other questions?
Gary, I just wanted to say thank you again, as a fellow descendant of loyalists. I think your presentation was one of the first that I heard, when I first joined LAAGS it's one of the earliest that I remember. And it's interesting for me to kind of circle back and think about, what I learned from it then, and then what I continue to learn about the loyalist experience. And so I have two lines of loyalists. One went to Nova Scotia and one went to Ontario. And I know from the work we've been doing with the book, talking about, I'm aware of Buxton, but I'm curious, you've talked about Birchtown, and I'm aware of Buxton. I'm just curious if you're aware of any other similar settlements kind of between. So my non-Nova Scotia line ended up near, I guess, close to Kingston, Ontario, kind of further along the lake. So I don't know. I was just curious if you or anyone else was aware of other similar settlements.
Well, I think Birchtown, because that's where the British decided that was the best place they could protect them.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in 1780.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was when you start seeing as America developed in the western part, because Ontario, as I said, sort of developed later. If you look at when, Saskatchewan and Manitoba developed, it was the go west young man type thing. There's more opportunity there for land. But I mean, obviously Canadian Manitoba is not great for growing either. But it did, there was more of an influx, and I think there was more of a mix with what they call First Nations, because Canada had a lot of what they like to call First Nations as indigenous people. But I think Birchtown gets it because the notoriety or the identification, because that's where the British went. But they found later on that, as I said, they moved to New Brunswick because it was, I think they felt more secure in places like New Brunswick. They were away from I think there was still the fear that being right there by the ocean, if the British left, or when the British left, not if they left, when they left, they were still going to be potential targets. The bounty hunters knew that's where the slaves went. So it wasn't safe for them to stay there. So plus it was like I said, Birchtown, if you go around there today, there's not much there. There's not much in some of the, so it was better for them to move to more inland and northern, away from the coast itself.
That makes sense. Okay, thank you.
And I think another thing, I think a lot of the, that's what spurred some of the growth we hear. I did the presentation about the Underground Railroad in Michigan, is that it was safer to go in north, because Canada had said, no, you can't come here and catch slaves.
I think it's also kind of important to note there were two waves. That loyalist set really was primarily the Nova Scotia, whereas the other, like the Ontario settlements, were more out of the early
Yeah,
18, like
That's
1820s,
right.
30s,
That's right.
40s.
Yeah, that's
So
good.
that's
Thank
when
you
more
for
of those
asking.
are kind of appearing.
yeah.
Yeah.
When there was the real, like I said, the Underground Railroad as it started to form, and although that that was almost completely separate, but I know that like I said, when I go, even in Toronto, when I was talking to the one that was related, that I could trace some relation with in Toronto, the he didn't know much about his genealogy, how his family got there. But it was interesting to see how Canada was evolved in a like an answer to Brenda's question, how Canada has wanted to evolve differently than the United States. And I think the people there just treated it differently. Now, that's not to say that there's no racists in Canada, because there are some that I've heard about and encountered, but the the picture was a lot different in the 70s and 80s and the 60s than, I mean, 1970s, 1980s than it was in the United States. Unfortunately, Dwight did miss this, but I guess he can listen to it on the, did you record it? Turn the
Hmm.
recording?
Yep.
Yeah, because he's the one that asked about how do you do a presentation, and
Yep.
it's obviously Jessica, I've done lots of presentations for this group. You find a subject, somebody brings up a question, and well, I can do that.
I want to know about that. I can
I
do some
want
research on that.
yeah, and like like I mentioned about my wife, I'm still trying to track down more about her, how her Canadian relatives got to be there
Hmm.
and why they went there. And I mean, Saskatchewan is not a place. I have not yet set foot in Saskatchewan. I've two more Canadian provinces to add to my list, one being Alberta and the other being Saskatchewan. The but you go to places like Manitoba and all of those kinds of things, and I was just reading yesterday how different the even the like the trees grow. It said that Canadian lumber is preferred over America, at least Southern America, U.S. lumber, because it's a lot stronger,
Right.
because the trees don't grow as much, so the rings are closer together, and it makes the trees stronger, the Canadian lumber. So, there are differences between the United States and Canada. And even though we both speak sometimes the same language, except now for the metric system, but it is kind of, and
I mean,
sometimes you
vaguely
still
we understand the difference. We just don't want to, evidently.
and you still go to, I mean, but I mean, Canada has its own thing. If you go to Quebec, I think I've told people the story. It's the first time I went to Canada when I was actually 10 years old, the year before that, the trip to Nova Scotia. But we went and asked for an ice cream stand for chocolate ice cream, and no comprende. And if anybody knows the word for chocolate in French, it's chocolat.
Hmm.
It's like they're close enough. But I ended up saying it because I had just started taking French that year, so I knew French, chocolate and chocolate with the were equivalents. But the person in Quebec did not, until I said chocolate. But then he gave us maple walnut ice cream, so I wasn't so sure afterwards, or he did it for spite. But I mean, it is a different country, and they view, and the attitudes are different, and the way they deal with things are different. I mean, Canadians have, they look at healthcare is not that I say that the healthcare is great from personal experience, but their view on healthcare is healthcare should be free. I mean, maybe some Americans would like that to be the case, but that's not been the case. And it's been, our views on a lot of subjects are different than Canadians. And if you spend as much time up there as I did, you learn that. I had, multiple projects in Canada, for a long time. And we visited Canada. My dad, for some reason, wanted to visit Canada all the time. Like I said, I've been to all but two of the Canadian provinces. I'll never get to the territories. They're a little too far to drive, and I'm not going to fly to these very remote places. But the Canadian viewpoint on life is a lot different than your average American to this day.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. Thank you for this presentation. It was wonderful.
You will. Thank you. And Dwight said he'd like to do a presentation. I think anybody who want to coach him, I told him I'd volunteer.